Hey guys, Dr. Michael Young here. Hope everything's going great in your world. We are moving ahead. We're moving into our sixth module, which is our sixth chapter. We're talking about an important topic this week. We're talking about international trade. Some of the things that we're talking about in this idea, we're going to start at the beginning. We're going to talk about how trade theory developed over time. We're going to talk about a guy that you may have heard of if you've taken an economics course, Adam Smith. We're also going to talk about a contemporary of his, David Ricardo. Both of these guys living in 16th century England, and they were talking about why it makes sense for countries to trade. We're going to bring in a more modern theory. This is a popular one, gets a lot of mileage in international trade discussions. It's called the Heckscher-Ohlin theory. So let's get started. The reason we're talking about these things is we're going to talk about the benefits of trade. But let me say right off the bat that I am not necessarily a 100% free trade guy. And I think that I speak for a lot of people when I say that I believe that the views on free trade have changed. I used to be more of a free trade guy than I am now. However, I see what's happened, and things have not really turned out the way that the free trade people talked about. I believe there are problems with free trade. One thing's for certain: whenever we have trade, whenever we open up our economy, as the United States has done and continues to do, pretty much, it doesn't benefit everyone equally. True, it brings cheaper goods and services, but that comes at the cost of some types of jobs. And so it tends to help consumers more than it does workers. It tends to help high-level people, high-level workers rather than low-level workers. But anyway, let's keep moving. Before I get into that, let's start talking about the benefits of trade. We're going to start back in 16th century England. Way back in the day, there was this group of people that were called the mercantilists. And to set the stage for this, you got to think about, this is back in the old days of kings and castles, and the rich country was thought to be the country that had the most treasure. And that treasure was usually in the form of gold and silver. And so mercantilists were talking about, hey, how can we get more gold and silver in the king's vault? If the king has a lot of gold and silver, we are a wealthy country. And how can we do that? Well, let's trade our stuff, the goods that we produce. We can trade that for gold and silver. And if we have more and more gold and silver piling up in the vault, then we are a rich country. So it was they were advocating government intervention to try to get more gold and silver, and they viewed trade as a zero-sum game. That means there's only so much gold and silver in the world at any time, or it's increasing very slowly through mining operations and whatnot. And if I get more gold, that's less for you. And so it was zero-sum. Anything that benefits me harms you, and vice versa. First major challenge to that theory was a guy named Adam Smith. You may have heard of old Adam Smith. He wrote a very famous book called The Wealth of Nations. It was published in 1776. Kind of an auspicious date for another reason. And he questioned that definition of wealth. He said, you know what? If a country has a bunch of gold and silver in the vault, is it really a rich country? Because, once you sell off that gold and silver, what are you going to do with it? You can't eat gold and silver. What can you do with gold and silver? It's not necessarily valuable in and of itself. So, this doesn't seem to make sense. And he also attacked this assumption of a zero-sum game. He said that people can trade and come out of it better off, then it's not necessarily if I win, you lose. So he presented this idea of a wealthy country, and he was writing for England at the time, He said, if England wants to be wealthy, we don't necessarily want to have a bunch of musty old gold in the vault, because that gold is not really doing anything. It's just sitting there. What we want to have is people producing and consuming lots of goods and services. So this is kind of a more modern view of a wealthy country. And today, when we talk about a wealthy country, we don't talk about gold and silver. Who knows how much gold and silver countries have? It's usually not a very important thing. What is important is the amount of goods and services that countries are producing. And so he came up with this idea of absolute advantage. He said that some countries are going to be better at producing wine. This was the exact example he used. Some countries are better at producing wine, others are better at producing wool. If those countries that are good at producing wine don't try to produce wool, produce only wine. Likewise, those are good at producing wool, produce wool, and they trade, we can both produce and consume more. So this was kind of the first free trade theory. It came from Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations. And it got rid of this idea of zero-sum game and introduced this idea of wealth as being standards of living and production of goods and services, and stated that both countries can benefit from this specialization in trade. A contemporary of Adam Smith was a fellow named Ricardo, who wrote a book, popular book, in 1817. Notice this is somewhat 20, 30 years after 1776 in The Wealth of Nations. And he took it a step further. He said, it doesn't just have to be a absolute advantage. Countries can still benefit from trade, even if one country is absolutely better off at producing everything. They can still benefit from trading with a less advanced country if the less advanced country has a comparative advantage. Now, this is kind of a tricky idea. It rests on the idea of opportunity costs, and it's along the lines of, if I do one thing, then I give up something else. If I do this, then I lose the opportunity to do something else. And so this is the idea of opportunity cost. We can think of it maybe from an individual level. Let's suppose, this is one that one of my professors told me many years ago, and I still remember it as an example. Let's suppose that we have a lawyer. Let's suppose that it's, do you guys know Bobby Warner? The Bobby Warner commercial, the Bobby Warner jingle. Bobby Warner, now's the time. Call 345-678-9. Let's suppose that Bobby Warner can make $1,000 an hour as a trial lawyer. But let's suppose that Bobby Warner also happens to be really good at painting houses. He can paint houses really, really quickly, really, really efficiently. And what of a movie? Now, should Bobby Warner paint his own house? Let's assume, again, that he doesn't care how he spends it. He doesn't necessarily like painting houses any more than being in a courtroom. He's just a happy-go-lucky guy. He's happy wherever he is. He just wants to make the most income possible. Should he paint his own house? Of course not. He can hire a local day laborer who's not necessarily good at painting houses and pay this person $10 or $15 an hour and still come out ahead, because if he takes time to paint house, it's taking away from his law practice. And so you could say that even though Bobby Warner is both at being a trial lawyer and a house painter, he has a relative disadvantage in painting houses because he has to give up a much more productive activity. The day laborer who cannot practice law, doesn't have hasn't passed the bar, doesn't have his law license, so he couldn't do that even if he wanted to. He's not that talented, but he can paint houses. Bobby Warner is better off to paint him even though he's better at both activities. So that's the idea of opportunity cost and comparative advantage. Now, like I said, this comparative advantage is very hard to argue with, and free trade economists have been trading it out for hundreds and hundreds of years, saying that if countries produce in free trade and everything works out in this simplified model, that the world will be better off and standard of living will be higher. There have been some critiques of that. For example, there was a guy, Paul Samuelson, who was quite popular. And he said, you know, what happens when a rich country like the U.S. enters into a free trade agreement with a poor country such as China, and that China rapidly improves its productivity after the introduction of a free trade regime? He said that the lower prices might not make up for the lower wages in the U.S. There's no doubt that when we go to Walmart, when we go to Home Depot, when we go to Sam's Club, when we go to the big box stores, most of the stuff in there comes from, well, probably the biggest single source is China. But most of it is made in other places, and it's cheap. It's cheaper. It's cheaper. Going to Walmart, you know, they got stuff that's cheap. It's a lot cheaper than what we could do if we tried to produce everything in the U.S. So there's no doubt that consumers benefit. But Samuelson said, and he's got a valid argument, lots of places have been devastated as a result of that. For example, in the Kanawha Valley, many of our traditional sources, the manufacturing jobs, many of those have gone. We used to make quite a few shoes in West Virginia. We used to make black glass up in Kanawha City, the old glass factory. There were tool factories in Kanawha City and then in South Charleston, and a lot of that has moved. It moved to China, and so lots of those high-paying jobs have left. And so Samuelson's critique was that those lower prices that we're getting for those goods and services have not made up for those lower wages in the U.S. He was also very concerned with the offshoring of high-paying jobs, such as service jobs. Historically, free trade has benefited wealthy countries, and the idea is that introducing protectionist measures may be harmful to the U.S., but again, not everybody benefits equally from free trade. And for some people, clearly, free trade has been more harmful than helpful. Next, we're going to look at Heckscher-Ohlin theory. This is also a popular theory. It's slightly more complex than David Ricardo. You got to remember, David Ricardo was writing in the 16th century, and Heckscher and Ohlin were writing in the 20th century. So they began to expand that and make it a bit more complex. And so they focused exclusively on what we would call factor endowments. Factors of production in economics is land, labor, and capital. So they believe that comparative advantage arises from differences in national factor endowments. Some countries have lots of land. Some countries have a large and possibly low-cost labor force. Other countries have more educated labor force. There may be cultural factors. Some countries have more capital. So, yeah, all of these factors they took into consideration. And it's not complex. It says that countries will export those goods that make extensive use of factors that are locally abundant, and they'll import goods that make extensive use of those factors that are locally scarce. Oddly enough, there was this guy, Leontiev. He was a Russian who won a Nobel Prize. And he did some studies, and he found that the Heckscher-Ohlin theory did not necessarily hold. And we still don't know why it didn't hold, because the theory seems to make sense. But he found that U.S. exports were less capital intensive than U.S. imports, which, according to the theory, should not be. Why do you think that's the case? If you have an idea, let me know. Next one was the product life cycle theory of international trade. This was developed by a guy named Vernon. This is from the 60s. And I don't know if you've taken a marketing class, but you may have taken a class in which they talk about how products go through a life cycle. Products, say for example, microwave ovens. Microwave ovens they were first invented by Raytheon in the United States. They were first produced in the United States. The first microwave ovens were very expensive. Then they went through a growth phase. And during that growth phase, more people began to enter the industry and production began to shift. It was no longer profitable for microwave ovens to be made in the US. And finally, microwave ovens as a product entered the maturity stage. And in the maturity stage, now, you find very few microwave ovens, maybe none, I don't know. Most microwave ovens are made in other places in the United States. There may be some that are made in the United States right now, but not very many. And so he claimed that this was a normal process of the product life cycle. He said that most new products, especially, remember he was writing in the 60s, were developed and first sold in the United States. And that's true for the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Most products were developed in the United States, which was very innovative. The wealth and size of the U.S. market gave U.S. firms a strong incentive to develop new consumer products. The high cost of U.S. labor gave U.S. firms an incentive to develop cost-saving process innovations. But over time, demand grows in other countries, price becomes the main competitive weapon, and U.S. producers can no longer survive. So, according to Vernon, in the introduction and growth stage, products would first be produced in innovative countries, particularly the United States. Then it would move to mid-level countries, and finally would move to places where labor is cheaper and manufacturing costs are lower. While the product life cycle is kind of accurate, historically accurate, that is, it was true in the 60s, now not so much, right? Most products are not just introduced in the United States. The United States is not necessarily the most advanced economy, or at least the gap between the United States and the other economies is not nearly as wide as it was in the 1960s. So products tend to be produced elsewhere. A lot of products are innovated and developed in other countries. So yeah, it seems increasingly ethnocentric and dated to talk about product life cycle as a viable theory. Modern theories of trade focus on lots of things. If a country focuses on a single product or a single product category, it's able to gain economies of scale. And those economies of scale may allow the world to produce more and more goods and services. It can also increase the variety of goods and services available to customers. And the fact is that with economies of scale, you may only be able to have a few producers. This is by a guy named Paul Krugman. You might have heard of him. He writes for the New York Times. Last one we're going to talk about is from one of my favorite guys, Michael Porter. Michael Porter is a very big researcher, in particular in the area of strategic management. And Michael Porter was trained actually as an economist, industrial organization economist, but he also got another PhD. He has 2 PhDs, one's in economics and one's in business administration. And he kind of went a little bit further in talking about why some countries have industries that are more competitive or less competitive. And he said that it depends on 4 attributes, okay? 4 broad attributes that shape the national environment in which local firms compete. These attributes are the factor endowments, that is, the land, labor, and capital. So he's not dismissing the Heckscher-Ohlin theory. He's saying factor endowments are important, but he said there are other things that are important too, like the demand conditions, the related and supporting industries, and the firm's strategy and structure and rivalry. And so these 4 attributes go up to make up his model. His model is called the diamond, and you can see it's shaped like a diamond here, and he has all of these things situated such that your factor endowments are related to your related and supporting industries. The related and supporting industries are related to the demand conditions. The demand conditions are related to the firm strategy, structure, and rivalry, and all of these things are related to each other. All right? So I think that's pretty clear, but if you have any questions about how that works, you can send me an email and ask me any questions you might have. So, what are the managerial implications of all of these things? Well, first off, as I told you, and I truly believe this, I think trade, it has to be managed. Total free trade doesn't necessarily work. We have to make sure everyone is following by the rules. And as I was living in China for 20 years, my views, this is the view that evolved. Because I was much more gung-ho on free trade some years ago, as I think a lot of my friends were, and a lot of researchers were much more for free trade. But now we realize that free trade brings allocation problems. It sometimes might create alienation and other problems. But at least as far as managers are involved, what are some of the implications of this? First off, managers need to choose a location. Firms should disperse production to countries where they can be performed most efficiently. Can the United States produce baby clothes? Hell yeah, we can produce baby clothes. If we would have some sort of a situation where we were forced to produce baby clothes, we could make some of the best darn baby clothes the world has ever seen. But they would be very costly. So should we produce baby clothes in the United States? Probably not. At least not on a large scale. It probably makes more sense for us to let our baby clothes, which is a low value added product, to be produced in other countries, and for us to focus on things like software, semiconductor chips, on creative services, movies. These types of things tend to be more high value added. Second of all, it pays to advance substantial resources in trying to build an early advantage. Product life cycle tells us that the early stages of a product often have higher margins. And Porter would tell us that the government should get involved to invest in education, infrastructure, and basic research. Okay, guys, it's me again. That's going to do it for this class period. Stay awesome, and I'll see you next week.